Hello, everyone, and welcome to Arcade Viking. Today is the official 22nd video and unofficial 16th video of my series on the early imperial expansion of the United States. The subject of today's video is the Jacksonian era in the early imperial United States, starting with the background to the Jacksonian era. So the background to the Jacksonian era really begins in its preceding era, which was an era that began in the aftermath of the War of 1812 CE, when President James Monroe would lead the United States into what would become known as the Era of Good Feelings between 1815 and 1825 CE, roughly. And this was an era that, at the time, by many, was viewed as a very prosperous era. However, towards the middle of this so-called era of good feelings, a major event would occur that would lead to its eventual decline. And that event was something known as the Panic of 1819 CE, which was an economic downturn that was driven by global market adjustments in the aftermath of the destruction of the Napoleonic Wars, which was fueled by excessive land speculation in public lands, which itself was then fueled by unrestrained issuance of paper money from banks and other businesses and business concerns. The Second Bank of the United States, which was deeply enmeshed in inflationary practices, would seek to compensate for its laxness in regulating the state credit and bank credit market by initiating a sharp curtailment in loans by its western branches beginning in 1818 CE. Failing to provide gold specie from their reserves when presented with their own banknotes for redemption by the Second Bank of the United States, the state chartered banks began foreclosing on the heavily mortgaged farms uh, and business properties that they had financed. The ensuing financial panic, in conjunction with a sudden recovery in European agricultural production in 1817 CE, would lead to widespread bankruptcies and mass unemployment. The financial disaster and recession would provoke popular resentment against banking and business enterprises, along with a general belief that the federal government economic policy was fundamentally flawed. Americans, many for the first time, would become politically engaged to defend their local economic interests. The Democratic Republicans, at the time the only party in the nation at the time, and their American system would be exposed to sharp criticism, eliciting vigorous defense from the Democratic Republicans. The panic would then also bring attention to issues regarding debt relief policy as well as poor relief. Uh, City and state governments would begin to more effectively approach the public policy reform issues surrounding the poor, creating a classification system that we actually still hold on to today, that being able-bodied versus disabled, temporary versus long-term, etc. There are more classifications within this system. Public attention would also be pointed to solving poverty issues, which would consequently lead to the creation of public education systems. The Panic of 1819 would also be credited with spurring American citizens to immigrate to the Mexican state of Coahuila y Tejas, which would eventually become the Republic of Texas and later the state of Texas within the United States. And here is my source for this information. In large part because of the Panic of 1819 CE, Monroe would begin to have four main political rivals, those being John Quincy Adams, John C. Calhoun, William H. Crawford, and Andrew Jackson. And this would eventually lead the to an event that happened in the election of 1824 CE, in which the election was inconclusive, as none of these candidates, Adams, Jackson, Crawford, or Clay, won the majority of electoral votes. Now, Jackson did win the popular vote, um, but not by much. And anyone who has paid attention to any elections in the United States knows that the popular vote is not what wins presidential elections, it is the electoral vote. This event leads the election to be decided by the House of Representatives, with each state delegation casting a single vote. With the help of Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams would be elected President of the United States, and Henry Clay would be promptly made his Secretary of State in what Jackson and his supporters would call the quote corrupt bargain. This election would end the era of good feelings on February 9th, 1825 CE. Because of this so-called corrupt bargain, political consensus would decline, and it would become the imperative in the eyes of many politicians to revive Jeffersonian principles on the basis of Southern exceptionalism, i.e., a focus on agrarian economy, limited federal government, belief in the common laborer, and personal freedoms and liberties. Now this brings us to the presidency of John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, before and after being elected to the presidency, was a proponent of what was known as the American system. So the American system was an economic plan that focused on high tariffs and land prices, federally funded infrastructure, and the development of a national bank. And it was one of the main systems that was spearheaded by Henry Clay. During his presidency, Adams would seek gradual assimilations of Native Americans via consensual agreements rather than forced removal. John Quincy Adams was also against United States expansion, believing it would overextend the United States and eventually lead to its collapse. Adams and other United States politicians would often use the overextension and eventual collapse of the Roman Empire as examples for the argument for less expansion by the United States. During his administration and his presidency, the Adams administration would sign mutual trade agreements with nations such as the Kingdom of Hawaii, the Federal Republic of Central America, and the Kingdom of Prussia. The Adams administration would also support South American revolutionaries such as Simon Bolivar and eventually the newly formed Republic of Gran Colombia, of which Simon Bolivar was the first president. Adams would also sign the Tariff of 1828 CE, which would set a 38% tax on some imported goods and 45% tax on certain imported raw materials. This tariff would help the northern states suffering from low-priced imported manufactured goods from Britain, with the goal being to protect northern factories by taxing imports from Europe. However, this tariff also heavily taxed imported goods from the southern states, which would lead southern politicians to call the tariff the quote tariff of abominations. With this tariff being signed as the name states in 1828 CE. Now, this brings us to our next section, the rise of Andrew Jackson. So, with the Panic of 1819 CE, as well as the so-called corrupt bargain and the signing of the quote-unquote Tariff of Abominations in 1828 CE, Andrew Jackson would begin to reform the agrarian alliance in both the North and the South under his leadership, which would in turn eventually lead to the rise of what would become known as the Jacksonian Democratic Party. And here's just a quick overview of the differences between Jacksonian democracy and Jeffersonian democracy. Jeffersonian democracy wanted a weak federal government with the executive branch deferring to Congress. However, Jacksonian democracy wanted a weak federal government, but with a powerful executive branch. Jeffersonian democracy believed a natural aristocracy would form from a well-educated elite. Jacksonian democracy would believed all men were qualified to hold office and introduced the spoil system to encourage political participation. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. The Jeffersonian democracy favored a small agrarian republic consisting primarily of yeoman farmers, whereas Jacksonian democracy advocated for all common men, farmers, factory workers, and laborers, to be able to participate in the democracy in the United States. Jeffersonian democracy believed that all men should have access to education at the public's expense. Meanwhile, Jacksonian democracy did not believe education was necessary to hold public office and opposed a public education system. Which now brings us to the presidential election of 1828 CE, which would lead to the second confrontation between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson on the presidential stage. Andrew Jackson, during this election, would campaign as a representative of the common man, despite being a wealthy plantation owner. And he would also use his victories in the War of 1812 CE, such as the Battle of New Orleans, to gain support from American voters. Andrew Jackson's campaign would also accuse Adams of being corrupt and would also accuse him of stubbornly holding on to his presidency when he should pass it off to the next candidate, i.e., Jackson. Meanwhile, the Adams administration will portray Andrew Jackson as a violent, unrestrained killer. They would portray his wife, Rachel, as an adulteress, and would also portray him, Andrew Jackson, as a slave trader who bought and sold enslaved Africans and African Americans in the interregional slave trade between Nashville, Tennessee, and New Orleans, Louisiana. It's very important to note when mentioning this that he was not attacked for merely owning enslaved Africans and African Americans for the use of work in plantations. He was accused of selling enslaved Africans and African Americans across state lines. He was not vilified for being an enslaver in any way in this instance. That being said, this accusation would then be picked up by the national media as part of a larger discussion about abolitionism and disunion. Immediately after winning the election, Jackson would declare much of the Adams administration corrupt and would remove roughly 10% of all federal employees. Jackson would then replace them with loyal Democrats. This act would function as political patronage and would become known as the spoils system, i.e., the spoils of war. Also, in the first couple of years of his presidency, Andrew Jackson would publicly and privately defend Margaret Eaton, the wife of Secretary of War John Eaton, who was accused by the wives of many members of Jackson's own cabinet of being an immoral adulteress for marrying John Eaton, who she had married only 9 months after the death of her first husband. This event would become known as the Petticoat Affair and would last between 1829 and 1831 CE. However, this was not the biggest this was not the biggest part of Andrew Jackson's early presidency. That goes to the Indian Removal Act. So, within the first couple of years of his presidency, Andrew Jackson would begin to legislate for the forced removal of Native Americans west of the Mississippi. The removal of Native Americans would be supported by many of the politicians in the United States, such as John C. Calhoun, and many southern states, such as Georgia. That being said, many other politicians, such as Jeremiah Evarts, Theodore Frillinghausen, Henry Clay, and the very famous Davy Crockett would oppose the removal of Native Americans. Not only that, many Christian missionary groups, such as the Moravians, would oppose the removal of Native Americans as well. And actually, all of these individuals that I mentioned, Everett's, Frillinghausen, Clay, and Crockett, would give speeches in the House of Representatives and in the Senate in opposition of the removal of Native Americans. Some of these speeches we'll read excerpts here. The first of these being from Frillinghausen, who essentially stated, and I quote, Mr. President, I propose an amendment to this bill by the addition of two sections in the form of provisios, the first of which brings up our consideration the nature of our public duties in relation to Indian nations, and the second provides for the continuance of our future negotiations by the mode of the treaties as in our past intercourse with them. The following is the amendment. Provide always that until the said tribes or nations shall choose to remove, as by this act is contemplated, they shall be protected in their present possessions and in the enjoyment of all of their rights of territory and government as heretofore exercised and enjoyed from all interruptions and encroachments, and provided also that before any removal shall take place of any of said tribes or nations, and before any exchange or exchanges of land be made, as aforesaid, the rights of any such tribes or nations in the premises shall be stipulated for, secured, and guaranteed by a treaty or treaties as heretofore made. And then we have the speech by Peleg Sprague, which reads, and I quote, Mr. President, the gentleman who has resumed his seat has indulged, Mr. Forsyth has indulged in a wide range of remark in defense of his state against imputations which he supposed to have been elsewhere cast upon her. This course may have been very proper in him. I fully appreciate the motive which induced it, but I have no occasion to follow him. I have no wish to derogate in the least from the character of Georgia, but rather that it should be as elevated as her most devoted sons can desire. I shall speak of her so far only as may seem necessary to the free discussion of the subject before us. This bill and amendment and the discussion which they have produced involve the question of the rights and duties of the United States with respect to the Indian tribes generally, but more especially the Cherokees. With that people, we have no less than 15 treaties. The first was made in the year 1785, and the last in 1819. By several of these treaties, we have unequivocally guaranteed to the Cherokees that they shall forever enjoy, first, their separate existence as a political community; two, undisturbed possession and full enjoyment of their lands within certain boundaries which are duly defined and fully described; third, the protection of the United States against all interference with or encroachments upon their rights by any people, state, or nation. For these promises on our part, we received ample consideration by the restoration and establishing of peace, by large cessions of territory, by the promise on their part to treat with no other state or nation, and other important concessions. These treaties were made with all the forms and solemnities which could give them force and efficacy by commissioners duly appointed, which could give them duly appointed with full power. They were ratified by the Senate, confirmed by the President, and announced to the world by his proclamation as the binding compact of the nation and the supreme law of the land. The Cherokees now come to us and say that their rights are in danger of invasion from the state of Georgia and Alabama. They ask if we will extend to them the protection we have promised and perform the engagements we have made. This is the question which they distinctly propound, which we must unequivocally answer, and we are now discussing with what our response shall be. There is a broad line of distinction between the claims of Georgia and those of Alabama and Mississippi, which seems heretofore to have been unobserved, by which I shall endeavor to keep in view. Let us first inquire what our duties are with respect to Georgia, for if her pretensions are unfounded, those of Alabama and Mississippi fall, of course. It is not necessary to determine whether the Indians have just grounds for their apprehensions or not, because the question is whether, if the rights secured to them by our treaties should at some future day be invaded, will we perform our engagements? But have they not some cause for their present alarm? In December 1827, a committee of the legislature of Georgia made a report accompanied by sundry resolutions, which were accepted by both branches, and the resolutions also received the approval of the governor. In the report, we find the following language respecting the territory of the Cherokees. The lands in question belong to Georgia, and she must and she will have them. Now, I will stop Sprague's speech there because it is a rather long speech. I believe approaching 15 to 20 pages. But I will link the source for these speeches in the sources for the video for anyone watching to read the full speech in its entirety. However, I believe his apprehension, Sprague's apprehension and opposition to the removal of Native Americans, such as the Cherokee, from their homelands to west of the Mississippi in the proposed Indian Removal Act is very clear. Then we also have David Crockett, whose speech is not actually recorded, but a record of his speech, a so-called sketch of his remarks, is placed in these records, where it is stated that he is very much against the removal of the Cherokee, and how he has actually talked to Cherokee and Chickasaw and other Native Americans, and whom he has befriended over the years, um, and realizing that they very much will, if they need to, fight to the end to stay in their lands. Um, and he, much like Sprague and Fring Houston, brings up the whether or not the fact that the United States is trampling on the rights promised to the Native Americans by the United States. And he also proposes very similar amendments to the Indian Removal Act as Fring Houston uh, within his speech, which you can read the sort of sketch of his speech here. Again, this is not his actual speech, but this gives a broad idea of of Davy Crockett's views on the matter, and those views being he was very much against them. Sorry, against the Indian Removal Act. Uh, However, despite this opposition, Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act would be passed by a narrow vote of 28 to 19 in the Senate and 101 to 97 in the House of Representatives on April 24, 1830 CE. As you can see by this vote and the speeches that I just showed to you, uh, this was by no means a widely accepted. Sorry, it was widely accepted, but it was by no means a universally accepted law. A universally accepted idea. Uh, and then because of this, both before and after the passing of the Indian Removal Act, many Native American nations in the Northeast would be removed to Oklahoma and Kansas Indian Territory between 1829 and 1836 CE, which I've already discussed in-depth in a video on the subject that I will link in the iCard, along with the video on the Era of Good Feelings. And you can see those removals here on this map. And a more up close view of this map showing the Native American nations that were removed to Oklahoma and Kansas Indian Territory during this time from the Northeast. And also, very much because of the Indian Removal Act, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Muskogee Creek nations would be removed to Oklahoma Indian Territory west of the Mississippi between 1830 and 1836 CE. And I've already done in-depth videos on all three of these, which I cannot link all of these videos in the iCard. I will link one of them in the iCard, and I highly recommend viewers go and check out the playlist for this series to watch the videos on these subjects. Then we need to take a look at some of Jackson's other early presidential acts. For one thing, Jackson would veto the Maysville Road Bill, which funded an upgrade of a section of the national road in Henry Clay's home state of Kentucky, arguing that it was unconstitutional to fund internal improvements using national funds for, quote, local projects, with this bill being vetoed on May 27th, 1830 CE. And Andrew Jackson would be the president responsible for ordering the United States military to put down Nat Turner's rebellion in August of 1831 CE. I've already done a in-depth video on this that I will link in the iCard. That being said, the biggest event in Andrew Jackson's early presidency, along with the Indian Removal Act, was an event known as the Nullification Crisis. So, what is the Nullification Crisis? Well, it was an event that really gets its start with the Tariff of 1828 CE, the Tariff of Abominations, which was something that was, as we already discussed, heavily criticized by many Southern politicians. In opposition of this tariff, Vice President John C. Calhoun and other South Carolina politicians would propose nullification in the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. In this document, they asserted that the Constitution is a compact of individual states, and when the federal government goes beyond its delegated duties, such as enacting a protective tariff, a state has a right to declare this action unconstitutional and make the act null and void within the borders of the state. With this, with this compact, with this exposition and protest, being delivered in December 1828 CE. Andrew Jackson would heavily oppose the concept of nullification, stating that Congress had and still has full authority to enact tariffs and that a dissenting state is denying the will of the majority. As a compromise, Jackson would support another tariff, the Tariff of 1832 CE, which reduced the duties and taxes from the Tariff of 1828 CE by almost half. And he signed this bill on July 9th, 1832 CE. But this bill, this tariff, failed to satisfy extremists on either side of the political spectrum. Afterwards, South Carolina would, on November 24th, 1833 CE, would pass the Ordinance of Nullification, declaring both tariffs null and void, and would then threaten to secede from the United States if the federal government tried to use force to collect the duties, to collect the taxes from the tariffs. In response to the threat to secede by South Carolina, Jackson would send warships to Charleston Harbor and would threaten to hang any man who worked to support nullification or secession. Jackson would condemn nullification as contrary to the Constitution's letter and spirit. He rejected the right of secession and declared that South Carolina stood on, quote, the brink of insurrection and treason. In response to this, as a result of this, John C. Calhoun would resign, and Jackson would ask Congress to pass a, quote, force bill authorizing the military to enforce the tariff, which was then attacked by Calhoun as despotism. Henry Clay and other politicians would then propose the tariff of 1833 CE as a compromise. Seeing it as an effective way to end the crisis, Jackson would sign the bill into law along with the force bill. The South Carolina Convention would then meet and rescind its nullification ordinance, but would nullify the force bill in a final act of defiance, officially ending the nullification crisis on March 2nd, 1833 CE. Which now brings us to our next section, Andrew Jackson's second term. So during the presidential election of 1832, Henry Clay would run against Andrew Jackson, with Clay extensively campaigning against the Indian Removal Act during the election. Clay and his allies would organize a new party known as the National Republican Party, not to be mistaken with the Republican Party that arose shortly before the Civil War that still exists to this day. They are separate things, much like the Democratic Republican Party is separate from both the Republican and Democratic Party. Then, at the same time, the National Bank, seeking a modified version of their original charter, would successfully convince the Senate and the House of Representatives to pass a recharter bill. Clay and other anti-Jacksonian politicians would support this bill, hoping Jackson would veto it and therefore hurt his chance of getting votes in the upcoming election, with this happening between January 6th and July 3rd of 1832 CE. Jackson, a longtime opponent of the National Bank, would unsurprisingly veto the recharter bill on July 10th, 1832 CE. Despite this hurting some of his votes, Jackson would still win the presidential election of 1832 CE. Viewing his victory as a mandate to continue his war against the National Bank, Jackson would sign an executive order ending the deposit of treasury receipts in the Second National Bank in 1833 CE. Jackson's action would lead those who disagree with him to form a new party known as the Whig Party. They would claim to oppose Jackson's expansion of executive power, calling him, quote, King Andrew the First. And they named their party after the English Whigs who opposed the British monarchy in the 17th century CE. During his second term, the Jackson administration would sign trade agreements with nations such as Siam, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire between 1833 and 1834 CE. Also, during this time, the Senate would censure Jackson for inappropriately taking authority for the Treasury Department when it was the responsibility of Congress, and they would also refuse to confirm Jackson's appointment of Roger B. Taney as Secretary of the Treasury on March 1834 in March 1834 CE. Jackson after signing the bill against the National Bank, would have federal funds deposited in state banks friendly to the administration's policies, which critics called pet banks. State banks were more responsive to state governments and invested heavily in land development, land speculation, and state public work projects. In spite of the efforts of Taney's successor, Levi Woodbury, to control them, the pet banks expanded their loans, helping create a speculative boom in the final years of Jackson's administration. That being said, Jackson would succeed in paying off the national debt, the only time in United States history that this had been and has been accomplished. It was paid down through tariff revenues, the careful management of federal funding of internal improvements like roads and canals, and the sale of public lands, with the national debt officially being paid off in January 1835 CE. Why also during this time, at the same time, the national debt had been paid off. While Jackson was leaving the United States Capitol building, Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter from England, would aim a pistol at him, which misfired. Lawrence would then pull a second pistol, which also misfired. Jackson would then attack Lawrence with his cane until others intervened to restrain Lawrence, who was later found not guilty by reason of insanity and institutionalized, with this event happening specifically on January 30th, 1835 CE. The Texas Revolution would also be a major event that would happen during Jackson's second term, with many white Americans, including political enemies of Jackson, such as Davy Crockett, fighting in the Revolution, with the Revolution happening between 1835 and 1836 CE. Then, in between 1836 and 1837 CE, the Jackson administration would admit Arkansas and Michigan into the United States, officially as states. Now this brings us to the presidential election of 1836 CE. During this election, Jackson's second vice president, Martin Van Buren, would run against multiple Whig candidates, including William Henry Harrison and Hugh L. White. In the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion and other events, chattel slavery would emerge as an increasingly prominent political issue, with many Southern politicians attacking Van Buren, stating that he could not be trusted to protect Southern interests, and they accused him of affiliating with abolitionists. Despite this, Van Buren would win the election of 1836 CE, which now leads us to the Van Buren presidency. And a major event that would immediately happen in the beginning of Van Buren's presidency, that being the Panic of 1837 CE. So, what is the Panic of 1837 CE? Well, it was an event caused by a variety of things. One, during Jackson's presidency, Jackson would transfer federal monies to state banks, specifically in 1833 CE, which caused Western banks to relax their lending standards, and the Indian Removal Act made large amounts of former Native American lands available for purchase and speculation. Jackson would also pass the Deposit and Distribution Act, which transferred federal monies from Eastern to Western state banks, which would leave Eastern banks unable to pay specie or gold currency to the British when they recalled their loans to address their economic problems in international trade in June of 1836 CE. Jackson would also mandate the specie circular, which mandated Western lands only be purchased by money backed by gold specie. This act was intended to stabilize the economy by reducing speculation on credit, but it caused a drain of gold and silver from the Eastern banks to the Western banks to address the needs of financing land transactions, with this mandate happening on July 11th, 1836 CE. All of these factors would lead to the outbreak of an economic depression, again, right at the beginning of Van Buren's presidency, which would lead profits, prices, and wages to drop. Westward expansion would be stalled, unemployment would rise, and pessimism would abound, with this depression becoming known as the Panic of 1837 CE. And it would continue between 1837 when its beginning and the mid 1840s CE. And probably very unsurprisingly, Jackson would be widely blamed for the Depression. Another thing that would happen just a year into Van Buren's presidency would be a petition by the Texas legislature to have the United States annex Texas into the United States. However, John Quincy Adams would prevent the motion from coming to a vote by filibustering for 22 days straight. As a result, Martin Van Buren, unwilling to cause a political scandal, would refuse to annex Texas into the United States. As a result, the Republic of Texas would begin inviting white Americans to immigrate to Texas, with many migrating to Texas to escape the Panic of 1837 that was still very much raging. Another very large event that is not very well known to have happened in United States history, let alone in the Van Buren presidency, was an increase in border violence with British Canada and the United States, which started when British Canadian soldiers boarded a small American steamer called Caroline, which was carrying white Americans recruited to join the Upper Canadian Rebellion. The British Canadian soldiers would briefly battle the white Americans, but before destroying the Caroline, with this event becoming known as the Caroline Affair, and this event specifically happening on December 28, 1837 CE. In response to this, white American raiders would attack Upper Canada a dozen times in what became known as the Patriot War between January 8th and December 4th, 1838 CE. Then, shortly after this, another conflict would break out between British Canadians and white American lumberjacks who would battle over disputed territory on the main Canada border. Tensions would escalate to white Americans calling for war with British Canada. Not wanting to start a war, the United States would mobilize Winfield Scott to the border, upon which Scott would successfully convince all sides to submit the border issue to arbitration. with this event becoming known as the Arstook War. And this event happening between 1838 and 1839 CE. Now, that being said, much like the Jackson presidency, arguably the biggest and most impactful event of the Van Buren presidency was that of the Indian Removal Act. Specifically, the passing of the Treaty of New Echota, the most recent cession of Native American lands as a result of the Indian Removal Act, by the United States Senate by a one vote margin. It would then be enacted into law in May 1836 CE, leading President Martin Van Buren to order 7,000 federal troops and state militia under General Winfield Scott into Cherokee lands to evict the Cherokee Nation on April 23rd, 1838 CE. Over 16,000 Cherokee would be forcibly removed and relocated westward to Indian Territory in a forced migration known as the Trail of Tears between 1838 and 1839 CE. I've already done an in-depth video on this that, again, I may not be able to link into the iCard, but it is part of this broader series. So I highly recommend viewers after this video go to the playlist for this series and watch the video on the Cherokee removal. Marching over 800 miles across Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas, the Cherokee would suffer from disease, exposure, and starvation, with as many as 4,000 dying on the way, nearly 1/5 of their population. And here's a map of some of their routes that were taken. Also, at the same time, Native American nations who had not been removed during the Jackson presidency in the Northeast would be removed between 1836 and the 1840 CE to Oklahoma and Kansas Indian Territory. And again, here's the map that I showed earlier in the video. And here's the up-close version of that, showing all of the Native American nations removed from the Southeast and the Northeast to Oklahoma and Kansas Indian Territory. Then there was another event that is much like the border disputes between the United States and Canada, is relatively lesser, is not very well known by many people to have happened during the Van Buren presidency, let alone in United States history. And that is the Amistad Case. So, what is the Amistad Case? Well, it was an event that began when members of the West African Mende people were kidnapped and illegally sold. And yes, we'll talk about why this was illegal in a second. Illegally sold into slavery and shipped to Cuba on the Spanish ship La Amistad on June 27th, 1839 CE. That being said, the enslaved Mende would successfully lead a mutiny and seize the ship on July 2nd, 1839 CE. The La Amistad would later be apprehended near Long Island, New York, by the United States Revenue Marines, one of the predecessors of the United States Coast Guard, and taken into custody on August 26, 1839 CE. As the British Empire had entered into a treaty with the Spanish prohibiting the slave trade north of the equator, they considered it a matter of international law for the United States to release the enslaved Africans. However, probably unsurprising to everyone watching this video, or at least a lot of people watching this video, the Spanish Empire held that just as America had ended its importation of enslaved Africans, but maintained a legal domestic population, so too had Cuba. Therefore, it was up to Spanish courts to determine whether or not the individuals were legally or illegally enslaved under Spanish law. The case would then be brought to the United States Supreme Court, with John Quincy Adams arguing for the freedom of the enslaved Africans, and Van Buren's Attorney General, Henry D. Gilpin, arguing for the return of the enslaved Africans to Spain, as Van Buren viewed abolitionism as the biggest threat to the United States, with this court case happening between February 22nd and March 2nd of 1841 CE. The Supreme Court would issue its final verdict. The Amistad Africans were free people who should be allowed to return home, upon which they did, departing on March 9th, 1841 CE. Now this brings us to our next section, the United States during the Adams presidency and the Jacksonian era. Starting with the Antebellum South. Now, real quick, there's a definition, a term that I need to define, that being the Antebellum South. What this was a period in the history of the southern United States that extended from the conclusion of the War of 1812 CE to the start of the American Civil War, with this era being marked by the prevalent practice of African chattel slavery and the associated societal norms that it cultivated. Over the course of this period, Southern leaders underwent a transformation in their perspective on slavery. Initially, they regarded it as an awkward and temporary institution, but it gradually evolved into a defended concept, with proponents arguing for its positive merits while simultaneously and vehemently opposing the burgeoning abolitionist movement. All right, so now with that out of the way, let's look at the Antebellum South itself. So, the Antebellum South, the economy of the Antebellum South was based on agriculture and plantation farming, with the South being less urban and having a smaller population than the North, which you can see in maps such as this here and here. And in fact, in this map, even with the increase in population density in the Antebellum South in the 1840s, it was still far less dense in terms of population than the North, with most of the largest cities in the United States being located in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, such as New York and Pennsylvania, and of course, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, etc., in New England. That being said, there were some exceptions to the rule in the South, such as Baltimore, Charleston, Norfolk, Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, Savannah, Georgia, Washington, D.C., etc. But again, as you can see in this table here, most of the large cities, urban centers within the United States during this period of time were located in the North. And as I already mentioned in the defining of the Antebellum South, the Antebellum South had a culture built on chattel slavery. African chattel slavery being the main driving force of the Antebellum South, as you can see here. And in fact, even with their comparatively small population to the north, as you can see in this graph here, this is a graph showing the population of enslaved individuals in the South, and you can see that it began to grow in the southern states between the 1820s and the 1840s, into the 1850s, and of course into the 1860s CE, though the 1850s and 60s are outside of the scope of this video. And as I've already said repeatedly in most of the videos in this series, as well as other videos like my video on the Nat Turner Rebellion, African chattel slavery was very much a brutal institution with enslaved individuals being tortured and punished in a variety of ways, including whipping being the most well known, but also tying people up and paddling them, as you can see in this picture here, um, beatings with rods, and even murder and executions for even any of the minorest infractions. And again, here are some more examples of what I just mentioned here. Also, entire African and African American families would be sold into enslavement and separated from each other in the Southern slave markets. Uh, White enslavers would also use Bible verses to justify enslaving African Americans, as seen in this Bible verse here from Genesis 9, verses 18 through 27. And in this verse here, uh, from the Apostle Paul's epistle to Ephesians 6, verses 5 through 7. So a subject that is discussed heavily in books such as Stephen R. Haynes' Noah's Curse, The Biblical Justification for American Slavery, and Charles F. Irons' The Origins of Pro-Slavery Christianity, both of which are cited in the sources of this video. That being said, Christianity and religion would also be used by abolitionists to condemn slavery. And this can be seen in a variety of writings. A couple of excerpts I will read in the next couple of slides. The first excerpt reading, and I quote, "It appears to me that America has become like the great city of Babylon, for she has boasted in her heart, I sit a queen and am no widow, shall see no sorrow. She is indeed a seller of slaves in the souls of men. She has made the Africans drunk with the wine of her fornication. She has put them completely beneath her feet, and she means to keep them there. Her right hand supports the reins of government, and her left hand the will of power, and she is determined not to let go or grasp." And here's the source that I got that excerpt from. And then the second source reads, "I confess my early and large indebtedness to him for enabling me to comprehend with irresistible clearness the inherent sinfulness of slavery under all circumstances and its utter incompatibility with the spirit and precepts of Christianity." And here's the source I got that excerpt from. During this period of time, as religion was beginning to be used to justify chattel slavery in the South, laws would be passed in all Southern slave states except for Maryland, Kentucky, and Tennessee, criminalizing teaching African Americans to read and write and restricting African Americans from holding religious meetings without a licensed white minister. Possession of abolitionist publications such as William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison being the individual that I got one of the excerpts from that we just read a couple of minutes ago, and George Fitzhugh's Sociology for the South or the Failure of a Free Society, both of which were criminalized in Virginia and other southern states. Also, after Nat Turner's rebellion, Nat Turner would become a symbol of, quote, terrorism and violent retribution in the eyes of white enslavers who would fear more rebellions by enslaved African Americans, something they called servile insurrection. Now this brings me to the northern states in the United States during the Jacksonian era, specifically the urbanization of the northern states. So, During the Jacksonian era, foreign immigrants, primarily from European nations such as Ireland, would begin to migrate to the United States, especially the northern states. And you can see the number of migrants between 1820 and 1850 alone in this table here and in this graph here, as well as in this table here. Um, these migrants would increase the population of northern cities, leading to increases in urbanization, which you can see in these maps here, were much like we saw in the section on the Antebellum South, with a few exceptions. Most of the urban areas uh, in the United States in the Jacksonian era, and also well up to the American Civil War and afterwards, were located in the northern states. And here's a graph showing the urbanization rate from 1790 to 2010. And you can see again, there is a nice little increase in urbanization, uh, a nice steady increase in urbanization that is relatively uninterrupted between 1830 and well into the 1930s. But of course, for the purposes of this video, between 1830 and the late 1840s, 1850 CE. And here is another table showing the number of urban areas by size categories during this time period, specifically in between 1820 and 1850 CE. And here's just again the table we showed earlier in the section on the Antebellum South, showing how the majority of major cities were located in the north. Here's an example of one of those northern cities. Uh, and also here is a picture of a very famous area of New York known as the Little Five Points, where the immigrants of various different European uh, countries would settle in New York. Now, this brings us to our next section that is connected to the um, agrarianism, the agriculturalization of the antebellum South, and its practice of chattel slavery, as well as the urbanization of the northern states. And that is the economy of the United States in the Jacksonian era. Again, starting with the southern United States, where the primary cash crop is cotton, as you can see in all of these pictures here. And here's a map showing all of the cotton farming areas within the South. And as you can see, they grow fairly quickly between 1820 and 1839 CE, taking up large areas of land. And with the South exporting large amounts of cotton between two areas such as the northern states, and the British Empire between 1820 and the 1850s CE. Again, here's some more graphs showing the number of cotton exports that were produced by the South. And here is another one of those here, showing the productivity estimates of cotton in all of these southern states. Which actually brings us to the economy of the northern United States. With the North having an economy based off of industrialization and factories, oftentimes textile and cotton factories, as seen here in the Lowell cotton mills uh, and this cotton mill here. And this is a graph showing the textile output of cotton in northern states in the 1830s. And this is also a subject discussed in papers and books by historians such as Lancey Davis and H. Lewis Stetler III in their book titled The New England Textile Industry, 1825 through 1860 Trends and Fluctuations, where again they show in various graphs the various mills in northern states between the late 1820s through the 1850s CE. And showing again, here's that as well as their output, the output of firms in Massachusetts in these two graphs here. One interesting effect of industrialization in the North during the Jacksonian era is industrialization would actually lead to some degree of increase in equality and financial freedom for women, as many women would seek to work in factories to gain this equality and financial freedom, becoming known as wage women. And you can see in this graph the number of female employees in the United States. And as you can see here in the Northeast and even a little bit in the South, but primarily in the Northeast, most of the women employees, female employees, existed in the Northeast, the northern United States. And here is a sort of a graph showing the various occupations that they could go into, the various factories and companies that these quote unquote wage earning women would go into to gain this freedom and this equality and financial freedom. And of course, unsurprisingly, the industrialization of the North leads us to our next section, industrialization in the United States. With industrialization starting really in the 1820s, with inventions such as the invention of the Blanchard lathe, which allowed for the mass production of firearms for the military, as well as the invention and installation of power looms in factories in the North, which increased the production output of textiles. Another major key factor of industrialization during the Jacksonian era was when coal mining became a major industry in the Northeast, specifically, well, not specifically, but especially in states like Pennsylvania. And you can see that here, the slow, gradual increase of coal mining in, in Pennsylvania from the 1830s into the 1900s and today. And here's all the various coal producing counties of Pennsylvania, with the light shaded ones being the bituminous coal producing counties, and the dark ones being the anthracite coal producing counties. And of course, as a result of this, coal would become the primary fuel for iron smelting in 1840 CE, which would lead the many iron forges and furnaces to begin implementing the new hot blast method developed in Scotland in 1828 CE, with this technique involving the preheating of air blown into a blast furnace or other metallurgical processes, which solved the problem of impurities from the coke contained in coal by burning them off. As a result of this, multiple large-scale iron furnaces. So as a result of this and the introduction of coal into the smelting process, multiple large-scale iron furnaces, such as the Scranton iron furnaces and Isabella iron furnace, would be built in the United States between 1827 and 1848 CE. Uh, which now brings us to our next section, improvements to infrastructure and transportation. In 1825 CE, the Erie Canal, which began construction during the era of good feelings, would finish construction in upstate New York, and then would be followed by the construction of more canals in the Northeast between 1825 and the 1840s CE, which you can see in this map here and here. Also, despite events such as the vetoing of the Maysville Road Act, new roads would be constructed throughout the United States, as seen in this map here and this picture here during the 1820s CE. And with the invention of steam locomotives, railroad tracks would begin to be constructed throughout the United States between 1829 and the 1840s CE, as seen and in this map here. Not only that, but steamboats would become key forms of transportations of goods and people on river systems such as the Mississippi River and the Oostenaula River in Georgia between really the 1810s CE, but they really reached their zenith between the 1820s and 1840s CE. Also, as a result of this increase of construction and use of steamboats for transportation, steamboats would become prone to boiler explosions that killed hundreds of people between the 1810 CE and the 1830s CE, which would lead the United States government to enact legislation that mandated boiler inspections by federal agents under the threat of revocation of the operator's navigational licenses and would lower the thresholds for liabilities in suits arising from such accidents, with this legislation being passed in 1838 CE. Unsurprisingly, the improvement of infrastructure and communication leads us to our next section, improved communication. With the construction of canals, roads, and railroads, the United States Post Office would then become able to more quickly and more frequently deliver news and mail, which you can see in this graph here, with the post office being able to deliver mail thanks to the construction of canals, roads, and railroads to individual houses 2 times a week by the 1840s CE. And here is that, again, that graph here showing the distribution of New York post offices with respect to the average number of daily mail between 1837 and 1841 CE. And here is a map of all the post roads in the United States during the Jacksonian era. And here is a very important map for when trying to visualize the effect the construction and improvement of infrastructure had on the rate of travel and the how quickly communication could happen in the United States. First, looking at this map here of the rate of travel in 1800 CE, where you can see that in order to, say, get mail to the western part of Louisiana, it would take 5 weeks to get it to Illinois. It would take 6 weeks. Then, with the construction of all the canals, roads, and railroads, this would be drastically cut down with mail and travel being able to reach Louisiana, the entirety of Louisiana by 2 weeks, and would be able to reach all the way up to parts of Michigan and Minnesota in only 6 weeks, whereas it previously took 6 weeks just to reach Illinois. Also, a very famous form of communication known as Morse code would be invented in 1837 CE by Samuel Morse and Alfred Vail, with the invention of Morse code being followed by the construction of the first telegraph line between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland, adjacent to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, that would allow for long-distance communication to be dispatched within minutes, with this construction happening in 1844 CE. Now this brings us to our next section, westward expansion in the Jacksonian era. So, in the wake of the removal of Native Americans to Oklahoma and Kansas Indian Territory, white Americans would settle in large numbers on the vacant land between the 1830s and late 1840s CE. And you can see that in this map here, this of the lands ceded by the southeastern Native American tribes as a result of the Indian Removal Act. And again, here is this map that we've shown a couple of times, showing all of the Native American nations removed from both the American Southeast and Northeast. Again, here is the close-up of it. And here is a map showing the rate of settlement by white Americans as a result of Indian removal, of the removal of Native Americans to Oklahoma and Kansas Indian Territory. And you can see in this map that in 1810, the area settled was just here in the orange, this orange colored area. And then by 1850, that had increased exponentially, as seen in this map here, in the area covered and shaded in yellow, which of course is very much connected to the removal of Native Americans to the west of the Mississippi to Oklahoma and Kansas Indian Territory. And here's pictures showing the settlement of these new lands by white American settlers. Which now brings us to our next section, significant cultural shifts during the Jacksonian era. With the first cultural shift and most well-known cultural shift of the Jacksonian era being the shifting of attitudes and state laws in favor of universal white male suffrage starting in the late 1820s CE. In conjunction with this, women such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Margaret Fuller, and Sarah Moore Grimke would campaign for equal rights of women, equal rights for women, which would lay the groundwork for suffrage movements, the suffrage movements of the 1910s CE, with these three women having campaigning for this specifically for the purposes of this video between the 1820s and 1848 CE. Now, obviously, they would continue to campaign for this well after this time period, but we're specifically talking about the Jacksonian era in this video. So they would, of course, campaign for equal rights for women during the entirety of the Jacksonian era. At the same time, abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass, James Forten, and William Lloyd Garrison would publicly condemn and campaign against chattel slavery through speeches, books, and newspapers, with these actions shifting the public opinion of many United States citizens on chattel slavery, which in turn would lay the groundwork for the eventual emancipation of enslaved African Americans during the American Civil War. And again, much like the women's suffrage movements, early women's suffrage movements, these campaigns would happen between the 1820s and late 1840s CE. And of course, well afterwards into the 1850s and 60s, but we're again talking about the Jacksonian era specifically. Then we have the reforms of the United States public school system that were launched by Horace Mann between 1837 and 1848 CE, with Mann specifically emulating the Prussian model of school, with the Prussian system having, by the 1830s CE, attained the following characteristics: free primary schooling, at least for poor citizens, professional teachers being trained in specialized colleges, a basic salary for teachers and recognition of teaching as a profession, an extended school year to better involve the children of farmers, funding to build schools, supervision at a national and classroom level to ensure quality instruction, curriculum inoculating a strong national identity, involvement of, as well as the involvement of science and technology, secular instruction, but with religion as a topic included in the curriculum, the placement of students in grades by age, uh, also, German immigrants would bring in kindergartens and gymnasium schools that specifically prepared students for higher education in universities. Man would also believe that women would be better suited for teaching, regardless of their status as a mother, and used his position to push for the feminization of the profession. He also advocated for a statewide curriculum and instituted financing of school through local property taxes. Mann also advocated for a secular school system with a religiously passive stance rather than sanctioning a particular church, as was often the norm in many states. Um, the legislature would prescribe books, quote, calculated to favor the tenets of any particular set of Christians, because obviously, uh, even as a even as he was trying to secularize the public school system, this just in a lot of ways meant that the various highly diverse denominations of Christianity were what he was focusing on, i.e., not focusing on one particular sect. Of course, also focusing more on science uh, and technology and things such as that. Mann also fought for protected battles against the Calvinist influence in discipline, preferring positive reinforcement to physical punishment. Um, under his system, under Mann's system, as well as the Prussian model, most children would learn to read and write and spell from Noah Webster's Blue Backed Speller and later the McGuffey Readers. Uh, After Mann implemented these reforms, most states would try to emulate Massachusetts, Mann's home state, uh, and New England would retain its leadership position for another century. And here are the sources that I got all that information from. Now, this brings us to our next section, the presidency of William Henry Harrison. So, in the election of 1840 CE, Martin Van Buren would run against Whig William Henry Harrison, with Harrison choosing John Tyler as his running mate, and Harrison, much like Jackson, campaigning on his victories in the War of 1812 CE with the slogan of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe being the Battle of Tippecanoe that Harrison won against Tecumseh's Pan-Native American Confederacy the year before the War of 1812 CE. Much like Jackson, Harrison's campaigning strategies would win him the election of 1840 CE. Of course, this is also in large part to the caused by things like the Panic of 1837 CE, which was wildly unpopular for very obvious reasons, and of course, the blame of which was placed upon Jackson and also by proxy Martin Van Buren. Harrison, upon winning the election, had intended to reestablish the national bank and also sought to reverse Jackson's spoils system. However, he died only 30 days into his presidency on April 4th, 1841 CE. Which now brings us to our next section, the presidency of John Tyler. After Harrison's death, Vice President John Tyler would become President of the United States. As Tyler only joined the Whigs in opposition of Andrew Jackson, Tyler did not embrace the American system of internal improvements, protective tariffs, and national bank proposals of the Whig Party leaders. Instead, Tyler's policies aligned more with the Jacksonian Democrats. Tyler would sign in 1841 CE the Preemption Act of 1841 CE, which was designed to facilitate settlement of the West, and the Bankruptcy Act of 1841 CE, which allowed individuals to declare bankruptcy. After Tyler would then go on to veto two bank bills, Henry Clay and Samuel L. Southard would convince most of Tyler's cabinet to resign on September 11th, 1841 CE. Then, in 1842 CE, after vetoing several tariff bills and bills to restore distribution, Tyler would sign the Tariff of 1842 CE. After the tariff vetoes, the Whig Party would then unsuccessfully attempt to impeach Tyler between July and August of 1842 CE. Then on August 9th, 1842 CE, the border issues between the British Empire and Canada and the United States would finally be resolved by Tyler's signing of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. Tyler would also, during this year in 1842 CE, would extend the Monroe Doctrine to the Kingdom of Hawaii, stating that Washington would oppose colonization of the kingdom by any European power. Between 1842 and 1843 CE, Tyler would dispatch John C. Fremont to perform two scientific expeditions into the interior of the United States. And then tragedy would strike. On February 28th, 1844 CE, Tyler and his cabinet would board the ship, the USS Princeton, to witness a demonstration of the cannon on the ship. However, shortly after, the cannon would explode, resulting in the deaths of 6 men and the injury of 20 people, with this event becoming known as the Peacemaker Incident. Then, in preparation for the presidential election of 1844 CE, Tyler would officially break from the Whig Party and would unsuccessfully try to become the presidential candidate for the Jacksonian Democrats. The final act of Tyler's administration would be the official annexation of the Republic of Texas into the United States on December 29th, 1845 CE. Which now brings us to our next section, the presidency of James K. Polk. So, during the presidential election of 1844 CE, the Whig candidate Henry Clay would run against Jacksonian Democrat James K. Polk, with James K. Polk winning the presidential election of 1844 CE. One of the first acts of Polk during his presidency would be to send General Zachary Taylor into territory disputed by the United States and the Republic of Mexico, which would lead to several skirmishes between the United States Army and the Mexican Army, which would result in the eventual outbreak of the Mexican-American War, with these skirmishes happening between 1845 and 1846 CE. At the same time, the Polk administration was successfully negotiating with the British Empire to gain the portion of the Oregon Territory south of the 49th parallel on June 15, 1846 CE. Then, eventually, between 1846 and 1848 CE, the United States would defeat the Republic of Mexico in the Mexican-American War. As a result of this victory, Mexico would cede territory to the United States, including the present-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and a small portion of Wyoming in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2nd, 1848 CE. While the Mexican-American War was happening, Polk would veto multiple bills meant to improve port facilities, believing that the bills were unconstitutional because they unfairly favored particular areas, including ports that had no foreign trade. And Polk stated that internal improvements were the matters for the states, not the federal government, to decide. Then Polk, during the presidential election of 1848 CE, Polk would not seek re-election, which would result in Whig Zachary Taylor winning the presidential election of 1848 CE, officially ending the Jacksonian era. Which now brings us to our last section, the aftermath of the Jacksonian era. For one thing, the acquisition of the Oregon and Mexican territory would lead to the creation of the Oregon Trail, as well as white American migration to regions such as California during the California Gold Rush between 1849 and the 1850s CE. Also, the Native American nations of California, the Southwest, and Oregon, as well as other regions such as the Great Basin and the Great Plains, would fall prey to genocide at the hands of the United States between 1849 and well into the 1900s CE. And you can see these maps here, the various Native American peoples and nations of California, the Southwest, and the Pacific Northwest. Also, another massive effect of the Jacksonian era and the Mexican-American War, specifically the territory gained as a result of the Mexican-American War, would lead to debates on whether or not chattel slavery would be allowed to spread to the newly annexed territory, which would result in the Compromise of 1850 CE, which essentially stated that the areas here in green were slave states, the Oregon Territory, and the state of California, were free states and territories, and then the territories of Utah, New Mexico, and the territory claimed by the state of Texas, here with the little striped lines, were allowed to decide whether they were slave or free territories by popular sovereignty. This would lead to continued animosity between abolitionists and white American enslavers over the issue of chattel slavery, which in turn would eventually result in the outbreak of the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865 CE. All right, and with that, that brings an end to our video. As I have said in most of the previous videos, I really hope you enjoyed the sections of the video that were about, for example, the creation of the public education system and the fight for equality by African Americans and women, and the industrialization of the North and such. But I really hope you did not enjoy the parts about, for example, the Indian Removal Act, as well as the heavy reliance and justification for the cruel treatment of enslaved individuals in chattel slavery. And I know that, as I've said in the previous videos, that is very odd for the person making the video to say, but as I've said repeatedly, I bring these events up not for entertainment, but for education, because they are often overlooked in the United States education system, and these are subjects that need to be brought up so that they can never happen again and they can be remedied. So with that, I will end this video. If you would like to see me cover any of the subjects I mentioned in this video in a later video or videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.